Good evening, everyone. I'm George. I'm the curator here. For those of you who don't know me, but most of you do, I think. I'd like to give you a very warm welcome to tonight's kitchen conversation, because there's so many of you. We're not in the kitchen, we're actually in the gallery, obviously, but we'll be going downstairs afterwards for some lovely food. We're thrilled to have two fantastic guests with us tonight. Serena Korda, who's our solo exhibition World Apple is currently on display across both our galleries until January 5th. And writer curator Hettie Judah, and both of them will be talking about the inspiration behind Serena's exhibition here tonight in the show. Serena is a multimedia artist and ceramicist who recently swapped London for Berwick-upon-Tweed in the northeast, and she's exhibited widely galleries and venues, including the Hayward Gallery, Camden Art Centre, Turner Contemporary, Alter Gateshead, the Hepworth, Blue Coat, the list goes on. And most recently in the Armory Art Fair in New York, and she was recently in South Korea as part of the ceramic pavilion there in October. Hettie Judah writes for The Guardian, Freeze, Times Literary Supplement, and Apollo, among others, and is also the curator of the Hayward Gallery touring exhibition titled Acts of Creation on Art and Motherhood, which is currently on display at the Sheffield Museums, but touring around the country. And that will be on display till January there, and then it will go to the CA in Dundee after that. It launched in the Art Feely back in March. I don't know if any of you would have seen that, but it was a fantastic show. Hettie has also recently released a book of the same title back in July, is that correct? Published by Thames and Hudson, which will be on sale in our shops soon. She has also, you'll see that there's handouts on the chairs there, very kindly written a essay and Q&A with Serena about the show, so do have a read of that, it's fantastic. So before we start, I'll just quickly run through the evening's proceedings. So we'll talk up here for approximately an hour until about 7 p.m, and then we'll open up some questions, and then we'll go downstairs and have some food prepared by our kitchen for about 7:15. And then if anyone has, if you could just put your phones on silent, that would be great, or turn them off until the talk's over. But that's about it from me, and I'll hand you over.
Thank you so much, George. It sounded like that mic was dropping in and out a bit, so I don't know if there's somebody that can...
you hear that? No way.
I've not noticed that when you're talking usually. Anyway, good evening, everybody. Really wonderful to be here with Serena. So the first work I saw of Serena's was in 2016, and it was called Hold Fast, Stand Sure, I Scream a Revolution. And it was on display in Glasgow as part of Glasgow International Festival that year. And it was, as always with Serena, a multifaceted kind of smorgasbord of art stuff. So the central bit of it was absolutely, sculpturally it was so beautiful. So she created these giant, so they were about 1.5 meters high, giant magic mushrooms complete with their roots out of porcelain, because that's a really sane thing to do. And they not only were beautiful sculptural works, but they also were functional, so you could play them as a set of bells.
You couldn't eat them, no.
And then there was also a binaural sound work that was recorded on the Isle of Mull, and there were all of these different aspects to it, and there was stuff about political revolutionary activity in Garnet Hill in Glasgow, and this thing about thin places in the Isle of Mull. So, one thing that became very evident encountering Serena's work for the first time is that you don't do things by halves. When you come to a project, it's just like, you're kind of throwing everything at it, and there are so many points of reference, and you're working across all these different media, and there's social engagement, and there's everything happening. And of course you brought that kind of like incredible, technical skill, but also this omnivorous enthusiasm and all these points of reference, very much to wild apples as well. So the first thing I really wanted to do was to start to pick apart a few of the different elements of the show and then to talk about how they kind of fit together. So the first one thing I wanted to talk about was you've made obviously large sculptural works in the past. You've also made works that reference the body, including a boob meteorite, which is at Camden Arts Centre. And more recently I've seen works where you've got kind of disembodied arms and eyeballs and mouths. But certainly in my experience, this is the first time I've seen you actually sculpting from the figure. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. So why here and why now? Why do you suddenly decide? Because I mean that's quite a big step to go from doing things that are very symbolic and object-based to really making figurative sculptures of the human body. That's a big departure.
Yeah. I feel like yes and no, I suppose, and in the sense that it felt like a natural progression from all these sort of limbs that I was sort of dancing around figuration, I suppose, and representations of the female body, and I think it felt like the natural progression to kind of, something that was really present was that I needed to deal with how, I guess, the male gaze in art history. I was just like, how do I do this? How do I do this without it being patronising, or I just not sitting right, but it felt like natural to start to think about the female body, but also not just the art historical kind of lineage of how women have been represented, but also from the medical aspect of how science has kind of not looked at our bodies really in the right way, considering a lot of research is done from a very male perspective, and we sort of suffer the consequences of that within women's health. But so I think this show felt like an opportunity to explore these images that I'd been looking at for a long time of the Slash Venus, the anatomical Venuses of the 17th century, and onwards of these sort of diagnostic tools in a way that were really hypersexualized and objectifying of women, but even when they're in their most vulnerable state, or maybe always when they're in their most vulnerable state, they kind of still have to salute to this ideal of what a woman should be. And I guess the only way I felt I could kind of think that through was by actually, sculpting the whole figure and attacking it full on and kind of figuring out how I was going to do that. And when I first started making the first crone, which is based on my own body, because as artists we often just use our own bodies because they're obtainable, they're with us, and we can just look down on when I was sculpting all those limbs, I was looking at my own limbs in the studio. But I really felt like I wanted to look at other women's bodies. I'd also, another really poignant thing was that I lost my mother, and kind of that it was very much a conduit for my grieving process, even though I maybe didn't realise at the time. Like, the work was in my head before my mum passed away, but as that was happening, it kind of became more urgent. I think with a lot of my work, it's like a personal experience or that needs to be figured out through the work, but it's not overtly, when it comes to the fore, it's not overtly about me, it's more human than that. And so that's why when I came to East Quay, I really wanted to be able to work. Well, I came thinking I wanted to sculpt these women's bodies, and that East Quay was the perfect sort of mediator for finding women to actually come and sit for me, and create a kind of safe space for me and for those women that would come to sit for me for those two occasions so that I could sculpt them.
So I mean, you mentioned when you were talking about the anatomical Venuses that even when, you know, a body's being dissected, there's this idea of perfection and this kind of classical ideal that the female body is meant to sit within. And of course, so much of the sculptural tradition is looking back to that kind of classical ideal. But you're here very much not doing that, and you're trying to look at real bodies. And I'm just interested as to whether, you know, there were technical challenges for you, you know, engaging with that for the first time, having to really properly look and not take for granted the shape that a body would be and the way that things would move together. Was it technically quite a big challenge?
Well, it was definitely technically. I think everything with anything that involves clay is like a technical challenge, I think, and a lot of my work is very process led, and that's not just, I suppose, the medium that that comes to the fore currently in the work is ceramics, but in the past it's sound now, as what has been, and it's come back through the show in terms of a material that allows me to almost like just really have an immediacy of an expression. And I suppose it's like with the sound, it's like a collection of data, but in a way from a place that is sort of soaking up like a sponge, or I sort of thought of it like, I described it as a marinade the other day, in a way, like trying to kind of bring all these things together, but almost so technically, but I think for me that process allows me to think.
You say, because obviously not everybody is part. I think you need to hold your microphone up a little bit higher, by the way, sorry.
No,
sorry, I just realised that Millie and George are looking concerned over there. I think it might have been to do with Millie's levels. You talk about the tenderness of the sittings. Can you expand on that a bit and just talk about this process of working together with the women and the sadness?
So I guess we put out an open call for people to come and sit, and we didn't think. Well, Millie and George were just like, maybe we might get 3 or 4 people, and we know some people that do life drawing and like life modelling. And I was like, I'd really like to just put it out to people, but I want people that would never normally do this come to do this, ideally. And basically we got over 20 people come forward. And they didn't just come forward, like we didn't ask for any information, we didn't really ask like why they wanted to be involved, they just would you like to do this? And we weren't paying people to sit, you know, but people came forth with so much personal information, and it seemed to resonate so deeply with the women that came forward, that they didn't want to become invisible, that they, you know, this reframing of older women seems so resonant with people, with women. And so I ended up narrowing it down based on what people had said and women's ages, because I really wanted a real diversity of ages through that period of the menopause and beyond. And also, I suppose, added information that people had privileged me with sort of helped make a selection. And then I phoned 8 of the women and had a kind of phone call, because I wanted to make sure the women realised I wasn't going to be creating a kind of portrait of them, that this was really about going on a journey with me into a very imaginative space, and there would be elements of me dissecting their body and looking at their body in quite a different way. So I was trying to manage expectations, but also hope that to find the right people that would be willing to go on that journey. And I found 4 amazing women, and basically we met them on the day at the reception at East Quay. We brought them up to the house where I was working, because it was someone had given me their house to basically use as a studio for 3 weeks while they were away. And made things nice and warm, and you know, and they just derobed, and kind of we just
Had
got on
any of
with it.
them sat naked for any kind of artistic endeavour prior to this?
No. Well, one of them had experience as a life model. And to be quite honest, I've been in life classes like you do as you go through art college, but I'd never been one-to-one with a model just posing for me and my work, and it was quite quite a thing to navigate, just that dialogue.
And it also seemed that there was that intimacy that wasn't just bodily, but also became, you know, in terms of your discourse with them, that you immediately had that intimacy where you were talking about very personal subjects really quickly.
Yeah, and I think that is women being in a room together. They tend to open up and feel that freedom to talk. It was interesting that one person that had been a life model was very like, you don't have to talk to me. It was almost like, you know, when you go to the hairdresser and you feel like you have to have that chat with your hairdresser. And I was just like, but she was like, you don't have to talk to me. And I was like, it was really nice that she said that and she gave me that space. But we did talk.
Because obviously you'd had this idea as an abstract concept, but you'd not worked on the figure before. Did that experience of being in the room with the women then change the way that you were addressing their bodies? Did it have an impact on the work that finally came out?
Yeah, I think I went with like a series of postures and poses that I've been like, a kind of mood board, I suppose, of like things that I've been collecting and figurines and like things that I wanted to maybe that had a familiarity in terms of this lineage of the way women have been depicted, but maybe to skew it slightly, and then very quickly realised that a lot of those poses are really unobtainable, and that they all must be really made up. And like when you really look at the things, because I was trying to get these women, you know, as much as they could. Obviously, some weren't as agile as others. Some were very sporty. Some weren't. You know, some could hold poses for long periods of time. And some couldn't, so it was very much a process of figuring out being sensitive to the person and not being like, you have to do this for me now, and just sort of realising, and then like the first pose actually took the longest, the first person I was working with, Sarah, and it was just basically both of our inexperience, I think, was just like, how are we going to do this? And then we finally found the right pose for her. She's the one with the bunny rabbit. And then it was a lot easier after that first sort of sitting. And I took loads of photos and I did lots of drawing, because actually something that changed was the clay body I was using, and any ceramicists here might realise that that's like a real no-no when you're about to start a project and you've only got 3 weeks to make the body of work. But also I changed my method, because I'd started with this hollowing out technique, which is very much where you have an armature and you just slap the clay on and you work really quickly and on the whole thing. And then I fired that piece at Claire Partington's studio. She's an amazing kind of like figurative ceramic sculptor. And she told me, no, Serena, you need cankles. You need like things around and that's where the animals kind of actually became, they're there for a kind of a more conceptual reason, but they're there also as a fundamental.
Yeah, they're literally a supporting cast.
Yeah.
But in a very architectural way.
Yeah.
You mentioned the fact that when you were having these conversations with people, you were saying this isn't going to be a portrait of you, but were you nervous about people seeing the work? Or, you've now had the show that's been up for a few months. What have the responses been? And I'm also wondering, when you've made this beautiful sculpture of somebody and then you're cutting into it, and did it feel like you were committing an act of violence to them?
Well, the first one was of me, and I did do it in the hollowing out way. It was very much like a surgery. Like I sliced the body, and you have to cut out the armature basically, so you have to surgically remove parts and then put things back. And I really liked that method, but realised how many problems it was giving me in terms of like the technical thing of getting it through the fire and all that stuff. So Claire sort of said, you know, her method is like this coiled build, and I was just like, yeah, I think I'm going to go with that. And you build from the bottom up. And so you sort of build, although there was some surgeries on them, I kind of built in and knew what I was going to do, and it's not that I necessarily discussed it, what I was going to do. With some of the women I did, I had an idea for certain people what I wanted to do to their head, and I ended up making everyone's head like this half zombie, kind of half alive thing. Anyway, so I think they'd seen the one I'd done of myself, basically. And I think they were kind of prepared in that sense of what was happening and what was going to happen. And so I didn't feel, that was what was so wonderful about this, because I think sometimes with other socially engaged projects you feel really beholden to the truth of what you're hearing and what you're gathering in terms of information. And with this I felt very free, because maybe I'd had those very deep conversations with the women, that it felt like there was this openness to kind of explore where I was going with it.
Yeah, I mean, I ask about the violence particularly because it's really notable with two of the figures that they've got very visible surgical marks. So you have, you know, one figure that's got a mastectomy scar, and then there's another who has a very long scar down one side of her abdomen. And to have that juxtaposed with this very precise kind of anatomical removal, I mean, it does feel, you know, it's quite upsetting in a way to look at it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I had the relationship with those women. I kind of see the brutal reality of it, but with a tenderness maybe of their stories, which are not going to be shared. You know, it's just there. It's in me, is what I soaked up from those encounters and those interactions, and I guess that's very true of a lot of my work. I guess I'm kind of like letting things filter through, and they're just, that's how I get them out, through making things. But not everything has to be told. But I think people maybe can read the violence or the different things, you know. The stories I was told were quite, I don't want to give anything away, but they were powerful stories, let's put it that way. And they were lives that had been well lived and powerfully lived, and they were just very, for me, like tender examples of how you can grow old with like guts and like take all the things that kind of come at you and like go, right, I'm going to get back up and I'm going to keep going.
So we've mentioned the anatomical Venus, but it seems to me that there are kind of three distinct sculptural traditions that you're kind of bringing together in these works. So there's the anatomical Venus, which I'm going to ask you to explain in a second, because maybe people aren't familiar with it. And the other one, it seems to me, is that you're really referencing that kind of rather whimsical tradition of the sculptural figurine, that kind of Royal Dalton, Staffordshire, you know, that kind of thing that you'd have on a mantelpiece or on your bookshelf. And then I also feel that you're participating in this kind of really fantastic feminist lineage of sculpting, you know, realistic women's bodies. I mean, you think about the work of Kiki Smith, where she very often uses her own body as the model. I think before we do that, I think we should probably explain what the anatomical Venuses were, though. Can you tell us what they were?
So they kind of came to the fore. I think they existed before the 17th century, but the really famous ones that are made of wax are these models of women. They're in very orgiastic, sort of hypersexualized sort of poses, usually quite classical poses as well, I suppose, from art history. They wear pearl necklaces, and sometimes they're clothed, but then their bodies are kind of opened up, so they have lots of sections, and they're like they were used as an early diagnostic tool, because people didn't want to touch women's bodies, I guess, and women wouldn't get undressed, and so there was this sort of politeness, but then it's really hypersexualized.
Yeah, some of them have real woman's hair, don't they, as well?
Yeah, they're very real.
Kind of made of, are they made of wax?
They're
usually?
wax,
Yeah.
and there's famous collections in Austria and Bologna. I've seen some of the Wellcome collection as well, like even older ones and the 17th century ones, but it was that period where they just flourished and kind of became very, very popular.
So it's this kind of weird enmeshing of a body that presents as sexually available, but is also available to be invaded and scrutinised and taken apart and to, yeah. So they're extraordinary objects. So to return to this idea of how do you see these different sculptural traditions kind of sitting alongside each other in the work?
Yeah, I think initially, because I was looking at lots of figurines, I was looking at lots of in terms of the positions, and so initially I wasn't thinking, I did want them to, I knew they were going to be green women. I kind of knew there was this kind of connection to nature spirits, the orchard, the wassail, which we'll probably get onto, but this sort of mining of a wild woman as well, I think was really important. And I think you write in your text of rude women, don't say it in that sense, but like in a way that that women can let it all hang out, basically, and it's okay, and it's okay not to conform to all these ideas of what beauty is, and that's beautiful in itself. But going back to the tradition of the sculpture, I guess I grew up, I think we all did, with those in our mum's house or our nan's house. They're just so familiar, and I think to conflate those sort of histories allowed me to kind of maybe, I think there's always that tussle in the work between the abject beauty and horror, and the thing that draws you in is the familiar and the cosy feeling, and that sense of the uncanny, I guess, that like you suddenly look and you're like, oh, I thought it was like a nice sculpture that I was familiar with, but it's showing me all its bits, and it's showing me its brain, and why is it doing this? And I suppose it's that conflation of different experiences that allow you, maybe bring you to the point of questioning what it is you're looking at.
Because technically, I was kind of, my mind was quite boggled technically by what you were doing in terms of the glaze and the paint. And it's funny you were talking about these women as kind of green women and that kind of wildness. I'm sure we did talk about that, but I'd forgotten that from our original conversation. And when I was looking at the sculptures in the gallery downstairs, and I think we'd just gone and had a cup of tea, and I was kind of going, actually, yeah, that's a glaze that I associate with kind of studio pottery. And it comes from that kind of, it's like a wholesome tradition of studio ceramics, that kind of, like blue, slightly metallic-y, greeny kind of glaze. And which seems very kind of loose, and it has that expressionistic studio pottery feeling to it. And then you get onto the bits that are anatomical, and they're crisp. So you've achieved what seems to be a real technical. You're leaping technically between different registers and different finishes in the work, which I think, from a technical perspective, is incredibly impressive.
Thank you. I think it's come out of like a trajectory of work where I don't make any of my glazes, and I will never. I did try once, and I will never again. And I use commercial glazes, but I mix them myself, and I like you'll get the powder, and then you can mix them up, but sometimes I get the brush on ones. It's all very alchemical with ceramics, and but you can get to a stage where you will know what you're kind of gonna get. Although I was working in a kiln that wasn't my kiln, and when you're working in someone else's kiln, you can fire something somewhere and it can be black, and then in another kiln it can come out gold. It's just like the nature of the beast. So, like, somehow, I fired these at the Bridgewater, Taunton and Bridgewater College, and with an amazing, just Millie found the kiln, and it was purely through dimensions that I needed I wanted them to be a certain size. But we also found this amazing technician there called Tim Cuff, who was just, we learned a lot from each other, because he's not a ceramicist, but, and I wasn't expecting anyone to be, but because I was like, literally, I dropped the sculptures off, I was like, I kind of need to be like, opened up really slowly, and every day you need to kind of like open up the plastic a bit more every week, and every week he sent me photos, like, he was the most amazing. I was just so lucky that he was there tending to them. And he'd take them through a firing, and we spoke about how the firing was going to go, and that's just, it's a nerve-wracking, crazy thing.
Yeah, we talk about this quite often, this thing with like sculptural ceramics. It's just so terrifying, because after all of this work, suddenly something can go ping, and you end up with nothing. And it's, I mean, I did a residency with a ceramicist last year, and everything melted in the kiln at the end of the residency. And then she was scared they were going to charge her for the kiln, because it melted and stuck to the bottom. Right. And it's just, I think you have to have a particular kind of, it's almost like a spiritual mindset as a ceramic artist, where you can just kind of like deal with the fact that you put all of this love in, and it just might,
There's that, and I think there's something, I'm quite a neurotic person, I will admit to that, and I think that there's something about like somehow the risk taking in the work that kind of like I lose it when I'm making. So it's a freedom of like maybe my wildness.
Yeah, and you originally wanted to put apples all over the floor, and I was wondering whether you decided that was just going to be like asking people to kick balls of glazed clay.
Yeah, basically. No, I mean, I think we got to the point of installing it, and then there was a lot of talk about stanchions and, like burying it off, and it was just like, no, this is going to completely, like, there needs to be no barrier to this work, otherwise it's going to completely wreck the whole, like, sensibility of it being an orchard type space, or, like an unswept floor, a 3D unswept floor was like what I was constantly thinking about in my head. But also like the windfall of an orchard. And so we went through a lot of different like ideas. I was almost going to put soil down as a sort of like pretend, and then it was like too theatrical, and I just really liked the way the colours worked on the floor, and the fact that it was directly on the floor. We just was like going to go for it. But we worked with those clusters, and like we had a few people come through to just navigate the space and see if it worked without loads of people kicking them. And there were some that got moved, like George texted me like a week into the show and said, people keep like walking into this area in particular, can we just move them? I was like, yeah, just move them, that's fine. That's good.
Has anybody nicked? I mean, I'd be nicking them if I never did.
They're stuck down, Hettie.
Rats.
They're all alarmed.
No, they are gorgeous objects as well, and it's really funny as well because it's. I know that you've worked quite a lot with casts from fruit and vegetables before, and you can once you know that about your work. I was noticing these bits of cauliflower kind of emerging from the tree trunks, and then you've got these wonderful Savoy cabbage leaves. But for me, that also brought it into the realm of also of the kitchen as well, because I think like a lot of people who lived through the 70s or had parents who lived through the 70s, I've got various bits of crockery that are modelled on Savoy cabbage leaves, or all of that kind of stuff. I had a great teapot that looked like a giant orange that I found in a charity shop. I mean, we've all got those bits and pieces, and so it did also come into that whole domestic realm for me as well.
Totally, I think like if you're working with that material, well for me, I think I draw from the different points of history of that decorative ware and the things again that are familiar through the kitchen where we use on the day-to-day functionality of things, but the work obviously has no functionality, but it's a nod to the lineage, the heritage, the history of decorative ceramics. It's it's lush. I love a lettuce leaf and a cabbage leaf. Who wouldn't? And all those, like the way that and it's used because the glaze pools so beautifully in the
And the little dimples.
And those dimples. And it's and like you say, I've got multiple casts of cauliflowers and Romanesco cabbages, and and I just sort of take my pick, and that builds up in your studios. You're like making these things, and they become like familiar friends that you can kind of go back to and go, oh, that's not working there. I'll just like stick a cauliflower on it. Basically,
I think it's a good rule for life, isn't it? It's not worth sticking a cauliflower on it. We talked a bit about the anatomical Venuses, but I wanted to kind of dive back into why you were particularly interested in having these excavated women's bodies. And I was also particularly interested in the sculpture that's based on you, because you've used a couple of different languages, sculptural languages, in the way that you've addressed this one. So realistic body parts, they're much more like a kind of, almost like a kind of anatomical, like a contemporary anatomical model, in a kind of, I'm not going to say Damien Hirst, but like the kind of stuff that he rips on. And then at the back of that, you have this very fleshy sculpture of a uterus, which is an emblem that you've used in the past. You've had kind of like these little uterus monsters with eyeballs and mouths, and they're fantastic. And it seems to me that this uterus emblem is particularly significant for the reason why you've also chosen to start to pick apart these bodies and to invade them. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. When I was going to start doing this, and I was thinking, because often, like we were saying with the Barty Kerr show and the fact that she uses the casts, there was a lot in the work that I was doing that was, I didn't want to use the cast of the body, because obviously for the show they're not life-size, but the previous works had all been sculpted, and there was a sense of the uncanny, really, that things looked very close to being real, but then when you got close or you looked closer, you realised they were like the hand from Evil Dead, and there's always that like reference to a horror film in the work, I think, that is like the prosthetic. And the phantom limb. So that was really important, and I think that I continued that in this work, but I was like, how am I going to sculpt these things? And I just got myself... so I had a skeleton called Sid that was really helpful, that's like about the size of the women. So I used... I'd say it's a him, but it should be a woman.
Sid can also be a girl.
It could be a girl, but I think
like Sid Charisse.
Sid Charisse, yeah, okay. Not defined, gender-wise. Basically, they were my kind of, they helped me like with the proportions and getting certain positionings, but also I bought myself a like mini scientific doll that had all those parts, and I basically cast those parts, and initially they do fit in the body, but then I realised that was quite a silly idea to place a load of ceramic bits in a body that then could just fall out and then chip. I was just like, this is no. Yeah, so they ended up just lying around the sculpture. But yeah, they're, in terms of the uterus, it was really interesting because I didn't have a uterus to sculpt from. It's very rare that there are models of uteruses, but it's really interesting when you even start reading about the womb that picture, and a lot of scientific diagrams aren't accurate. They're a two-dimensional diagram of a 3D thing that's inside your body that's filled with blood and muscle, but yeah, that it is a representation and a lot of information is lost, but I didn't realise that the ovary isn't completely connected to the fallopian tube, and that's how much I know about my body. And that's the shock of it all, because there's a sort of shame around that part of the body and the way it's represented. And I was just like, I want to make this really like this animal that's hugging this woman. And partly it ended up there because of the cankles, because she was the first one that didn't have any. So all the sort of weird offally guts that she's sort of sliming through, that it's sitting on top of, it was just sort of, I was adding to make her stand up, because she was gradually going, oh, and she is kind of on the lean. If you look at her from the side.
Well, lots of those wax figures aren't they? Because they to melt a bit as they go a bit. Yeah.
But so I actually used the intestine that I had, the intestinal kind of cast, and I spent the afternoon like making an intestine into a uterus. That was quite interesting, and then sort of like developing.
I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I think we don't want to.
It was a fun afternoon. But ironically, that my sister works for Nature, and she was doing a journal about the link between cancer and early menopause, and she suggested my piece, and it's ended up in the journal. So it's quite a funny intervention that it's sort of ended up in the science journal. I think it's kind of hilarious, but yeah.
That's amazing. But also, you've got to find the glaze, or the finish on the glaze on those is really one. Like the fleshiness of them is actually, it's almost difficult to look at. It's really great. That's what you want, isn't it? It's making people comfortable. Something's wrong.
That's true.
I want to kind of talk a little bit about the kind of Somersetishness of this and the specificities of the place and how that came into it. Did you, I mean, I don't know how the conversation started between you and George. Did you come with an idea? Did he approach you and then you kind of thought about stuff? Where did the specifics of place start to come into this, besides the actual women?
Well, George came to see a piece of my work, and we started to just have a chat, and then it was about a year later I was like, I'd really love to come and visit. Well, he said, come and visit, or I'd really like to work with you, and so I came down, and obviously I'd had this idea in mind. I did come down with a set of ideas. I had a vision of these apples, I had a vision of naked women, but I didn't quite know how it would fit into the Somerset environment, but the apple, I knew it was a fruit-bearing county, and then my very brief research like popped up with the wassail. And so the first thing I did is sat down with Jess and George, and I just said, look, I'm really interested in the wassail, and instantly, as is with this place, I know someone who does a wassail, who has a wassail, and she might be in the audience here, Amanda, and her family has an orchard, and and it's quite a new wassail, so it's very feminine wassail, I would say. From going, and I've never been to one, but I said, right, I'd really like to tap into this tradition, because it really spoke to me, or resonated with me, and that idea of the nature spirits that was swirling around my head, and that this orchard was a garden of earthly delights, but maybe like the apple is so loaded symbolically.
Can you just, I'm going to put a pin in that, can you unpack all that, you talk about the apple being loaded symbolically, there's obviously Eve, but what else do we have with the apple in terms of symbolism?
Lilith, that's left out, I guess, or
sorry, that felt like I was supposed to be a spot test.
Yeah, no, but I suppose maybe other people could throw apple symbolism at me.
No, but I feel like you that thorough text that you're so interested in.
Actually that came later. Again, I was looking for the title, because I think we were calling the pieces the Crones, we were calling the show the Crones, and I think Jess and George said, well, there's the other work in the show too, do you want an overarching name for the show? And I was sitting and looking and thinking and reading, and then I saw this wild apples, and that just it sang about the wildness of the women that I was trying to represent, the fact that crab apples are wild apples, and felt like connection to this place. So, and that people might read it and go, oh, there's a show about apples down at East Quay, let's go and see that. And be like, all right, please, luring them in. Come and taste my fruits. So, yeah, so I think coming with the Judeo-Christian symbolism of it is heavy enough. It's like, it's just, and how else did it tap into this place? And so the wassail started to open up to me as this tradition where you're singing to a tree, you're praying for a good harvest, you're taking out the bad spirits and you're bringing in the new spirits, and all these things kind of like, we're like, yeah, bring on singing to trees, this is great. A lot of my work is about animism, and it's about like flattening out this anthropocentric view of the world. So we need to sing to trees more, and drink cider.
Yeah, both.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite interesting. So I'm going to end up by talking a bit about ritual, but you've been interested in ritual quite a bit in your work, and you're quite interested in exploring older rituals in traditions. And I think it's kind of very interesting because that brings us into a whole world which is seen as very distinct from the world of fine art, which is, folk art. And you also work in ceramic sculpture, which for a very, very long time was seen as being a craft practice. And it seems to me you're on you're on very dangerous grounds here. But kind of maybe enjoying that kind of like slightly engaging with stuff that is not necessarily the comfort zone of...
Yeah, like menopausal old women aren't the comfort zone, are they? They're not sexy, they're not, well, society says that. So it's kind of like, bring it on. Because, I don't know, it's a medium that speaks to me, that I use. It's not the only medium I use. A lot of people came up to Gallery 2, it's not on at the moment, but it's a film I made back in 2013, and I make films sometimes. But it has been a medium that I've worked in like quite a lot for the last 4 years, and that's mainly because I needed a singularity of voice because I became a mum and I didn't have the time to be doing a smorgasbord of stuff, but my kid's 5 now, and I'm like, I want to do that smorgasbord of stuff again. So the more stuff is coming back and confusing everyone. So they don't know. I'm a comedian, I suppose. It's like, it's hard to pin down what I do.
I really love having that extra element of the sound actually downstairs. It kind of pulls everything together in a really interesting way. So my final question for you before we open up to questions from the audience is really going back to that thing of ritual, because it is a really important, like ritual and performance and ritualistic responses to performance seem to be very important parts of your work. So in the transmitters upstairs there is an almost ritualistic response to performance. In the show I saw in Glasgow, there were these quite ritualistic bell ringing performances. And I'm interested in the kind of figure of the artist.
And I don't think it's only the role of the artist to create those rituals, and I think rituals and traditions can be invented and are invented. They just hang around for a long time and they get changed and shifted through how they move through society and generations. I have quite a problem with the image of the artist as a shaman. It sits really uncomfortably with me, and I think for me, ritual is about offering it up to the people, and it's about people coming to create a ritual. So, for instance, in the sound, there's a very triggering sound that you said your sister doesn't like, and a lot of people after you said that, the crunching of apples, said it's a really triggering sound. But it was a sound that I wanted to create, and with the amazing kind of community here of artists came to come spend an hour with me just chomping on apples, and it was a really powerful experience. None of us, I didn't think, oh, this is going to be really powerful. I was just chasing a sound, but it was actually a really it was very generous of everyone to come, and it was just. It was a sharing, it was a convening. And I think in those moments when people convene, things get easier, and that's why things like ritual and witchcraft and magic have come to the fore, I think, in the last decade maybe, because we're living through such difficult times politically and emotionally, and people aren't turning to organised religion, they're turning to a kind of space where they can create their own rituals and their own power. And that's what I enjoy offering up, but I think it's available to everyone. It's democratizing of the folk being able to help each other, basically.
Go folk art.
Yeah.
Serena, thank you so much. I think we've got kind of 10 minutes now for questions. Do you have another microphone?
We don't have a microphone.
So if you just pop your hand up and I will... Okay, so we've got a gentleman here in the second row.
Hello, Serena, hello. My question is, you talked a little bit about dissection and surgery and the internals of the body. And you captured it amazingly as a non-biologist. I thought was awed by it. Have you studied anatomy, or did you do a study in anatomy for this show? How did you capture it so well?
I did not. I have not. I've never been lucky enough to be in those sort of situations where you can. Lucky enough, I don't sound really disturbed. But sometimes they are opened up to doctors, dissections are opened up to artists, and maybe that's something to do in the future, because I am really fascinated by it. Looking at pictures, basically, and absorbing things, just looking and looking and looking and looking at a lot of anatomical Venuses, which are super kind of precise depictions of these internal organs, but looking at drawings from that period as well, and just observe, just looking on that level, but not, I've never done any kind of in real life things, but that could offer up some other possibilities, so thoughts for the future.
We've got, there's one towards the back there.
Yeah.
What I really appreciated was the level of consent that you were working with the models. So I remember that exhibition about 20 years ago, it was with that Bodyworks, that doctor would plasticise people, and there was so no consent with that. I was just wondering now how the relationship is with the models, and how are their responses to themselves and work, and how have they reacted to seeing themselves?
Yeah. They two of them were able to come to the private view, and I know all of them have seen the work, and I've had really lovely messages from the two that I didn't see again, and I'm kind of in touch with one of the models in particular, and I think if you watch the film and Babs, just breaks, she's just amazing, steals the show. But she just, I didn't realise that our conversations and what I was doing, you don't know as an artist what impact you're going to have on anyone, but obviously meeting those women had a huge impact on me, and their stories had a huge impact on me. And although they're not portraits of them, they came, they stood, they had their pictures taken by them, they really went on the journey, and I just love them for that, that they, like you say, they consented to having themselves sort of depicted in this way, and actually sort of some of them were kind of surprised at the way they were depicted, is that really my body? And I'm not saying that it was exact in any way, but there was a kind of, I was trying to be true to what was in front of me as well as this element of distortion. But they're I think they're happy.
I think it also goes to such an interesting question where there's this convention that in some way the artist painting the figure is exploitative, and to think about other ways also that, there's a friend that I sit for a lot, and I know that actually it's it can be fascinating having somebody else's view on your body as well. It's not exploitative at all. It can actually be, I mean, therapeutics are pushing it a bit far, but it's got a kind of freeing aspect to it as well.
Yeah.
Do we have another question? Oh, sorry, I can see that.
Yeah, I wanted to also ask about this dissection motif that you've used in relation to a woman's journey, which is really beautiful actually. When I know this is my reading of it, but when I was looking at them, it didn't so much feel like something that was being done to them, but something that they were revealing. I mean, they're literally showing everything of themselves, and you just talked about the honesty of their stories as well. And so it made me think about the descent motif, which is about the heroine's journey, about going down to reclaim something and bring something back. And so my question was, having done this with these women and also shared the stories, has it changed, have you felt you've gone on a journey with that, and has it changed you? Have you, because just looking at them, it felt like something really grounding and honest about women is just showing all of themselves. How did that affect you going through this process?
Yeah, no, it's really, really interesting question. I think every project changes you in a way, or I mean, definitely this journey, because on a personal level, I've been through the death of my mother and moving house, and like the two biggies that kind of create like so much personal kind of like distress, and so it's so destabilizing. And I think when I met these women, part of it was, I think I cared for my mum towards the end. Sorry, it's like quite emotional. And I wish I'd looked at her body more. So, oh God, but yeah, so I wish I'd looked at her body more. So, but yeah, so I think doing this gave me that back. Sorry.
I think on that note, thank you so much for just being wonderfully you and just opening up about everything, Serena.
I'm sorry. Thank you.